At some point, you realize something important. The loop isn't just happening, it's continuing. There's a difference between those two things, and that difference is where everything begins to change, because when something is just happening, it feels fixed. It feels like there is nothing you can do about it. But when something is continuing, it means something is allowing it to continue, and that shifts the question. It's no longer just why the loop exists, it becomes what is keeping it going, because the loop doesn't restart itself without a condition being met. It doesn't continue without a process being active. It depends on something, and that something is happening in real time. This is what makes it possible to change, not by forcing the loop to stop, but by understanding what allows it to keep going. Because once that becomes clear, the loop is no longer something that feels permanent. It becomes something that is being maintained, and anything that is being maintained can also be interrupted. The loop continues through interaction. Not just the presence of thoughts, but what happens after they appear. The moment a thought enters your awareness, there is a response, sometimes subtle, sometimes strong, but always there. That response is what determines whether the loop continues. If the thought is followed, expanded, analyzed, or resisted, it gains more time, more structure, more presence. It moves forward, and because that response happens quickly, it feels automatic. It feels like part of the thought itself, not something separate. But it is separate. It is the step that keeps the process going. Without that step, the thought doesn't develop in the same way. It appears, but it doesn't build. It exists briefly, and then it fades. So the loop is not driven by thoughts alone. It is driven by the sequence that follows them. And that sequence is where change becomes possible. Not before the thought appears, but after. What makes this difficult to notice is how fast the sequence happens. The thought appears, and the response follows almost instantly. There is no visible gap, no clear separation. It feels like a single event, but that gap does exist, even if it's small. And within that gap, there is a shift that can begin to happen. At first, it's not control, it's awareness. The ability to see the thought as something that has appeared rather than something that must be followed. That awareness doesn't stop the thought. It changes your position relative to it. Instead of being inside the loop immediately, you begin to see it as it starts, and that changes the dynamic. Because once you can see the beginning of the sequence, the rest of it is no longer invisible. It becomes something that is unfolding, not something that has already taken over. And that distinction is what begins to weaken the automatic nature of the loop. The next shift is subtle but important. It's recognizing that not following a thought is different from trying to stop it. Trying to stop a thought creates resistance, and that resistance becomes another form of engagement. But not following a thought does something else. It removes the continuation. It allows the thought to exist without extending it. When a thought appears and you don't immediately build on it, it doesn't gain the same structure. It doesn't develop into a chain. It remains at the level it first appeared, and without that development it begins to lose presence. Not instantly, but gradually. It doesn't hold your attention in the same way. This is where the loop begins to break, not by force, not by control, but by the absence of continuation, because the loop depends on being carried forward, and when it isn't, it cannot sustain itself in the same way. What begins to change as you stop automatically continuing thoughts is how they behave once they appear. At first, they may still feel strong, still carry the same urgency, still pull your attention in the same way. But without immediate engagement, they don't expand. They rise to the surface, but they don't build into something larger. They don't connect as quickly to other thoughts, don't develop into extended sequences, don't create the same sense of movement. This reveals something important, that the intensity of the loop is not coming from the thought itself, but from what happens after it appears, the expansion, the connection, the continuation. And when that expansion is reduced, the thought begins to feel different, not weaker in a forced way, but less sustained. Less able to hold your attention over time. This is where the loop starts to lose its structure, because without expansion there is no chain, and without a chain there is no loop. only individual thoughts appearing and fading, without connecting into something continuous. There is also a shift in how your brain interprets thoughts when they are not followed. When a thought appears and is consistently engaged with, your brain marks it as important. It strengthens it, prioritizes it, makes it easier to access again. But when a thought appears and is not followed, your brain begins to adjust. It no longer receives the signal that this thought needs to be maintained. It becomes less prioritized, less reinforced, less likely to dominate your attention. This doesn't happen immediately. The pattern has been built over time and it changes gradually. But the direction is clear. The less a thought is reinforced, the less influence it has, and over time this changes which thoughts appear most easily. The ones that were previously dominant begin to fade in frequency, while others lose their intensity. This is how the loop weakens at a structural level, not by removing thoughts, but by changing how they are reinforced. Another important shift is how you relate to the feeling that something needs to be resolved. The loop is often driven by the sense that there is an answer you haven't reached yet, something you still need to figure out. But when you stop automatically following thoughts, that sense of urgency begins to change. The need to resolve the thought becomes less dominant. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer controls your attention in the same way. You begin to notice the thought can exist without being completed, that it doesn't have to lead to a conclusion, that it can remain open without requiring immediate resolution, and that changes the dynamic, because the loop depends on the drive toward completion. It depends on the idea that something must be finished. When that idea loses its intensity, the loop loses one of its main drivers, and without that drive, begins to slow. As this becomes more consistent, your experience of thinking begins to shift in a noticeable way. Thoughts still appear, but they don't immediately pull you into a sequence. They remain more contained, more separate, more temporary. There are small gaps between them. Brief moments where nothing is being followed, nothing is being expanded, and those gaps begin to replace the continuous flow that once felt constant. At first, those gaps are short, easy to miss. But as they become more frequent, they begin to change the overall rhythm of your mind. Instead of continuous movement, there is space. Instead of constant looping, there are moments of stillness between thoughts. And that change in rhythm is what allows the loop to lose its dominance. Not because it has been forced to stop, but because it is no longer being sustained in the same way. And that is what breaking the loop actually begins to feel like. As the loop begins to weaken, something else becomes noticeable. The thoughts that once felt dominant no longer carry the same automatic authority. They still appear, but they don't immediately define your experience in the same way. Before, a thought would appear and quickly take over. It would shape your attention, influence your state, and pull you into a sequence before you had time to recognize it. But now, there is a delay, a small separation between the thought and its impact. That separation changes how the thought feels. It no longer arrives as something that must be followed. It arrives as something that can be observed, and that observation changes everything. Because when a thought is observed instead of followed, it loses momentum. It doesn't build into something larger. It remains at the level it first appeared. This is where the loop starts to lose its ability to sustain itself, because it depends on immediate continuation. And when that continuation is no longer automatic, the structure begins to break apart, not suddenly, but steadily. Your attention also begins to behave differently. Instead of locking onto a thought and staying there, it becomes more flexible. It can shift without being pulled back as strongly. It can move without being anchored to the same patterns. This flexibility reduces the grip of the loop, because the loop depends on sustained attention. It needs continuity. It needs your focus to remain in the same place long enough for the sequence to develop. When that focus becomes less fixed, the sequence cannot form in the same way. It starts, but it doesn't hold. It appears, but it doesn't continue. And that changes how the loop feels. It no longer has the same strength, the same persistence, the same ability to pull you in repeatedly. Because without stable attention, it cannot maintain itself, And that shift in attention is not forced. It emerges naturally as the pattern of engagement changes over time. There is also a change in how your brain interprets repeated thoughts. When a thought is no longer followed every time it appears, it begins to lose its status as something important. It becomes just another thought, rather than something that stands out. This reduces its priority. Your brain stops treating it as something that needs to be revisited constantly. It no longer marks it as a pattern that requires attention, and because of that, it appears less frequently. Not because it has been removed, but because it is no longer being reinforced. This is how the loop fades at a deeper level. The thoughts that once drove it become less dominant, less central, less likely to trigger the same sequence. And over time, the entire structure begins to dissolve, not through effort, but through a gradual shift in how the system responds to those thoughts. And that shift changes what your mind returns to. At this stage, the loop no longer feels like something you are trapped inside. It becomes something that appears occasionally, rather than something that defines your experience continuously. You may still notice the pattern starting, a familiar thought, a familiar direction. But it doesn't pull you in the same way. It doesn't carry the same momentum, and because it doesn't continue, it fades more quickly. It doesn't build into something that holds your attention for long periods of time. This changes your relationship with the loop. It is no longer something you are inside of. It is something you can see as it begins and ends. And that perspective removes the sense of being stuck, because the loop is no longer continuous. It is no longer dominating your attention. It becomes something that happens, but does not remain. And that is where the shift becomes stable. As the loop continues to weaken, you begin to notice something that wasn't visible before. The process itself becomes clearer. Not just the thoughts, but the way they appear, the way they attempt to continue, and the way they fade when they are not followed. This visibility changes how automatic everything feels. Before, the loop operated without being noticed. It felt like a single continuous experience. Now it becomes a sequence of separate moments. A thought appears. There is a pull to follow it. And then there is a choice, even if it feels small, about whether that pull is acted on. That sequence creates structure where there was previously only flow. It makes the process visible, and what is visible becomes easier to understand. And once the process is understood, it becomes less convincing. It no longer feels like something that has to continue. It feels like something that can continue but doesn't have to, and that difference begins to change the entire experience. There is also a change in how your mind reacts to the beginning of the loop. Previously, the start of a familiar thought pattern would go unnoticed until you were already inside it. Now the beginning becomes more obvious. You recognize the pattern earlier. The same tone, the same direction, the same structure starting to form. And because you recognize it sooner, the loop has less time to develop. This early recognition reduces the depth of the loop. It doesn't have the same opportunity to build into something extended. It starts, but it doesn't reach the same level of intensity. And that changes how it feels. It becomes shorter, less immersive, less dominant. It doesn't take over in the same way. Because the earlier a pattern is seen, the less it can grow. And over time, that early recognition becomes more consistent, making the loop easier to interrupt before it fully forms. Another shift happens in how your brain responds to repetition. When a thought is no longer followed every time it appears, repetition stops reinforcing it. Instead of becoming stronger, it begins to lose its effect. The thought may still repeat, but it no longer feels as impactful. It doesn't carry the same weight, the same urgency, the same pull. It becomes more neutral, more predictable, less engaging. And because it is less engaging, it receives less attention. And because it receives less attention, it weakens further. This creates a new cycle, one where repetition leads to reduction instead of reinforcement. The more the thought appears without being followed, the less influence it has, and over time, that changes how your mind prioritizes it. It becomes less central, less dominant, less likely to initiate a loop, and that shift begins to reshape the entire pattern. There is also a noticeable change in how you experience silence between thoughts. Previously, those moments were brief and often unnoticed. Your mind would quickly fill them, maintaining a sense of continuous activity. Now, those moments begin to expand, not dramatically but enough to be recognized. You notice when nothing is being followed, when there is space instead of sequence, and that space feels different. It is not forced, not created through effort, but emerging naturally as the loop loses its continuity. This changes how your mind feels overall. It becomes less crowded, less intense, less driven by constant movement. The absence of continuous looping allows for a different kind of stability. Not the absence of thoughts, but the absence of constant continuation, and that stability becomes the new baseline over time. As this becomes more consistent, your relationship with thoughts changes in a fundamental way. They are no longer treated as signals that must be acted on. They become events that can be observed without immediate response. This removes the automatic link between a thought and its continuation. The thought appears, but it does not automatically lead to more thinking. It exists on its own without requiring expansion, and that independence changes how thoughts behave. They become shorter, less connected, less capable of forming loops. Because without connection, there is no sequence, and without sequence, there is no loop. This is where the system begins to stabilize, not by removing thoughts, but by removing the conditions that allow them to combine into continuous patterns. And that shift changes the overall structure of your thinking. This doesn't mean the loop never appears again. Patterns that have been reinforced over time can still activate. But when they do, they no longer behave the same way. They start, but they don't sustain. They appear, but they don't expand. They are recognized quickly, and that recognition prevents them from developing into something larger. And because they don't develop, they fade more easily. They pass through your awareness instead of holding it. This changes the experience from being inside a loop to seeing a loop begin and end. It removes the sense of being trapped and replaces it with a sense of movement. Not continuous movement, but movement that starts and stops. And that difference is what makes the loop feel manageable instead of overwhelming. What this ultimately shows is that breaking the loop is not about eliminating thoughts or forcing your mind into silence. It is about changing the conditions that allow the loop to continue. Those conditions are subtle. They exist in how thoughts are followed, how attention is applied, how repetition is reinforced. And when those conditions change, the loop changes with them. It becomes less stable, less automatic, less dominant. It no longer defines the experience of your mind in the same way. And that shift happens gradually, not as a sudden change, but as a consistent adjustment in how the process unfolds over time. And that consistency is what allows the change to last. Because the loop is not removed, it is no longer maintained. And once that becomes clear, the idea of breaking the loop begins to feel different. It is no longer something that requires force or control. It becomes something that emerges from understanding. Thoughts still appear. Patterns still exist, but they no longer carry the same ability to continue automatically. They depend on conditions that are no longer present in the same way, and because of that, the experience of your mind changes. It becomes less repetitive, less confined, less driven by the same cycles, not because the system has been stopped, but because it is no longer operating under the same patterns. And that is what breaking the loop actually is. Not stopping thoughts, but ending the pattern that kept them repeating.